great to be with you here at the Fresh Streams conference, and really looking forward to the seminar that we're going to have together, exploring this issue of how do you lead in the middle of a crisis. The last year has been dramatic, hasn't it, in terms of how it's impacted our ability to lead and the environment in which we are leading. We've all been through the experience of responding to a global pandemic, to an emergency. At times it's felt like we've been on an emergency response team responding to a major crisis in our community, where we've seen the need to run around and to help rescue people in the midst of a global crisis. Just thinking back to April and the first experience of this emergency, where hospitals were being built, lives were being saved, our frontline workers were being clapped, and we were in the midst of how on earth do we respond to this crisis. And then over the last 6 to 9 months, we've been through this cycle of emergency response and then recovery, and then going back into response mode again as a second wave comes. And maybe we know that there will be a third wave even after Christmas, before we get into the vaccine and the hope that that will bring to the whole of our society, and then thinking about how do we recover and how do we reconstruct after this. And I've been using all through that time this mechanism of response, recovery and reconstruction to help us think about how we frame our leadership in this moment in time. But there's no doubt in the midst of that actually, as we've gone through emergency response and as we've gone through recovery, that actually we've had to learn to lead in a different way. We've had to learn to lead in the midst of uncertainty. In many ways, it's exposed the myth that we were ever in control, and helped us to wrestle with these issues of how do we lead when we can't plan? How do we lead when we can't even plan beyond today or tomorrow, where the horizon of our leadership isn't 3 months or 6 months or 9 months or a year or 3 years or 5-year plans, but actually 5-minute plans, 5-day plans if we've been lucky. So how do we lead within the midst of that great uncertainty? And how do we lead in the midst of heightened emotions as well? There is a reality that we've come close to death, that we've come close to our own sense of mortality. And within that, our value systems have been thrown up in the air, and we don't yet know where they're going to land. And our emotions have been dragged left, right and centre. Who do we have in our family groups for Christmas being the latest one, as well as seeing people struggling with the issues of mental health and us struggling with our own mental health. And how do we find the emotional language to engage with people who've lost their job, who have, when we're facing large scale unemployment, who haven't been able to go into a church building for over 9 months and probably will be 12 months now, are having to face up to the needs to wear masks. And so we see this great level of uncertainty, and we also see a massive sense in which our emotions are heightened, and leaders saying to me, Simon, how do we lead during this time? How do we lead, and when's it going to end? There is a reality here that I think that whereas we're full of hope that a vaccine will come, actually that as leaders, the way that we navigate these next 12 months is going to continue to be challenging to us and uncertain to us. The reality of stepping back into a church building and leading again in April and May, when people are maybe able to gather once more, is going to be as challenging as responding in the first time, because everybody's expectations are up in the air, everybody's values are up in the air, everybody's sense of what's real and how do we rebuild. There are going to be many more different voices that are needed in this midst of uncertainty. I'm reminded of a situation that happened for me maybe 10 years ago. And as part of my role with Samaritan's Purse, I took about 10 to 12 chief execs, senior leaders from businesses into rural Mozambique. And as we travelled into Guija district and we camped under the stars in a local village, and we didn't know what we were going to have for food for the next day, all our decision-making ability was taken away from us. And actually, we were just pleased that there was food on the table, and we were just pleased to survive. And actually, the sense that we were in lockdown there made us quite pliable to what was happening, and the decisions were easier because we knew we were within a set of constraints. And then we took those business leaders back into the Holiday Inn in Maputo in Mozambique before they flew back to Heathrow as a kind of how do we help you re-enter back into your normal home life. And we came down for breakfast the following morning, and people started complaining because there was only orange juice, and there wasn't orange juice and apple juice and tomato juice and whatever other juices you normally have. And there is a sense that actually we are going to have to navigate a situation where people start to be released from lockdown, start to be released from the constraints, and actually start to map out a future for themselves, which is intensely uncertain, but also has many more opportunities. And I think what we're going to see is people really wrestling with that. What kind of future do we want to build? What kind of hope do we want to bring? What kind of community do we want to build as we come out of isolation? And as leaders, we're going to lead through that. And that's going to require two things of us. And we're going to explore these two things in the seminar together. So first of all, it's going to require us to navigate continuing uncertainty. None of us have been here before. None of us have rebuilt out of a moment of a global pandemic and a global emergency. None of us really know how to do this and to do it well. Yes, there's things we can learn from global emergencies. Yes, there are things we're going to learn from one another, and we need that community and that sense of working together. But how can we navigate that uncertainty? And so in the seminar, we'll be exploring this issue of polarities. Now, if you're like me, I'm 55, I'm a baby boomer. We were brought up to solve problems. In a certain world, we were brought up to understand all the data, to find out the issues, and to go and solve a problem and get a problem fixed. The reality in an uncertain environment is that we're often wrestling with tensions. I call them polarities. We're wrestling with polarities. We're wrestling with uncertainties and the need to grapple with those. Now, in the pandemic, we've seen a number of those that have just been heightened for us. We've seen our government wrestling with health or economy. Do we look after people's health and look after the vulnerable, or do we seek to maximise the benefit to the economy during this crisis? Which one is more important? How do we manage that tension, and how do we manage that uncertainty? As church leaders, you've wrestled with the online versus offline. How do we engage our congregations, many of whom haven't wanted to go back into the building, in an online world, as well as coping with those who actually really want to get back into, really want to understand what it means to rebuild in a physical sense? So how do we manage that tension of online and offline? And in the seminar, I'll take you through 12 polarities, and we'll look at those and think about what it means and give you some tools to help you work through what it means to lead through a time of uncertainty, and how thinking about tensions and polarities can help us in navigating that continuing uncertain space which is going to exist for us. And then secondly, we're going to look at this whole issue of finding a new emotional language. The reality that actually during 2021 we're going to see an outpouring of mental health issues, things that we've pressed down, things that haven't been talked about because we haven't been in community, are going to rise to the fore. And as leaders, creating the environments in which people can look back and can process what's happened to them over the last year, can process the sense of anxiety, the grief that we've had, that can remember what we've been through before we accelerate into growth, that actually we can help people process and work through their own mental health and well-being. And so I think it's going to be really important for us as leaders to find a new emotional language. And empathy is going to be right at the heart of that. Empathy, the ability to see the world through other people's eyes. It's been well said during this crisis. Same storm, different boats. If you're a frontline health worker, you've experienced it differently to the way that I've experienced it as a home worker, working from my office, which is where I'm speaking to you from now. A really different sense of what this crisis is going to be, has been about, and different struggles. And our ability as leaders to really lead out of our own sense of identity and to see the world through other people's eyes and create an environment in which people are able to be really vulnerable and really honest and really share about what they've learned during this time is going to be so vital as we start to reimagine the future and reimagine what that can be like. First of all, we need to listen. We need to really, really listen to people. We need to hear the stories of what's happened. We need to hear the testimonies of what's happened. We need to create safe and supportive spaces where people can wrestle with their grief and where their emotions, where there can be a real sense of lament about what has happened and a real sense of engaging with one another and learning from what's happened before we start to rebuild. And so I would plead for us as leaders to create the space for that to happen, not to rush back into celebration, but to actually engage with a lament and an emotional outpouring that allows people to share what they've been through. Because I fear what will happen if we don't do that is that the emotions will get pushed down, that the feelings that we've had have been pushed down, and then actually we'll get a massive schism, a massive fracture happening between those who are resilient and bold and celebratory and have the gift of engaging and looking forward and being hopeful, actually creating a massive schism between that and our desire to get back in and to welcome and to embrace, and also our need to process and to process well. And so there are some great tools. Kintsugi Hope Wellbeing Groups is one that I'm involved in, that are just helping people to create those safe and supportive spaces to enable people to engage in their own emotions. And then lastly, so we'll look at uncertainty, we'll look at empathy and our emotions and engaging with those. And then finally, we'll look in this session about how we look forward and how we create a sense of vision and purpose in the midst of this uncertainty. How do we set the riverbanks within which our leadership is going to happen? I'm a great one for strategy. I love working with teams on 5-year strategies and directions for organizations is what I do for a living. But the reality is, in the midst of uncertainty, how can you set and give a sense of purpose and hope to your people? And how is that freeing and enabling in this environment? I learnt this through my experience in emergency relief and disaster response, where we would send people into situations like responding to Ebola in Liberia, or the civil war in South Sudan, between South Sudan and Sudan, or an earthquake in Nepal, or responding to the crisis in northern Iraq and what had happened in Mosul. And in those situations, we learned how important it was to be very clear about your purpose and vision, to set that as the direction for people in the midst of responding to uncertainty. And then how important it was to articulate your values and your ethos, and also your theory of change and your operating principles, and to create a set of riverbanks within which the organization and your church can actually flourish and grow during this time, and how helpful that is as leaders to be able to give that sense of purpose. So I'm looking forward to the seminar with you on Monday the 11th at 3:30, engaging with you in thinking through these issues. How do we lead in the middle of crisis? And I hope the tools of thinking about what phase we're in, response, recovery, or reconstruction, of thinking about how do we manage uncertainty and how can polarities and tensions help us to do that, thinking about our own sense of emotional well-being and how we create this new emotional language to engage with people in their emotions, and then thinking about how we set direction and purpose and riverbanks. Some really useful tools that we'll share with you. I really look forward to engaging with you in that session and hearing your views on these issues, as well as we all work together to see God's kingdom come in the United Kingdom in a fresh and a new way in the days ahead.
So, Father God, thank you so much for this Fresh Streams conference. Thank you that so many people have been able to engage with it in different ways, and thank you for all the tremendous resources that are being made available to us, and the opportunity to encounter you in what we hear, in what we explore, and in the stillness of listening to your Spirit. And Father, we pray that your Holy Spirit will be at work powerfully through these 3 days, and that you'll speak into our hearts and lives, that you'll bring clarity, that you will bring freshness, that you will bring vision among us. And whatever our circumstances, whether we are feeling quite positive at the moment, whether we're feeling really tired and exhausted, or anything in between, that you will come and speak into our lives today. And we pray that this session will be a very significant part of that, and pray that you'll bless Simon as he shares material with us, and as we explore that together. We commit this time to you, Lord, now, and trust for the work of your Spirit in each of our lives. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
So Simon, thank you so much for being here, and over to you now.
Paul, thank you, and it's a delight to be with you. I'm speaking to you from Ipswich today, and wherever you're joining in from, lovely to see you all. We're thinking about leadership. I wonder 9 months ago, if you'd known that you were going to have to lead through a pandemic that would go on this long, whether you would have signed up to be a leader in the middle of a crisis or not, or whether you had been running fast in the opposite direction. Lots of shakes of heads there. I'm just going to do a poll quickly for you that will appear on your screen. And the question on the poll is this: after 9 months of this pandemic, as a leader, which of these words sums up your main emotions? And you can select up to 3. So optimistic, hopeful, determined, cautious, uncertain, disappointed, numb, tired, exhausted. Select up to 3. You can select 1 if you like, if that's your overwhelming sense of emotion. Or select a couple if you're feeling a mixture of emotions as well. We've had 9 of you, 10 of you, 11, 12 of you voted. So just take a few more moments to have a go on that. 17 of you. Anyone else going to have a go? Brilliant. I'll just leave it up there for another 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And here we go. So I'll just show you the results of that. So really interesting, I think. So 70% of you put tired in there, and 45% of you uncertain. Not many of you are exhausted, but if you are, and whatever emotions you're feeling today, I hope this session will be really hopeful for you and uplifting for you. There's a sense in which we're all dealing with heightened emotions right now, whether we're optimistic, hopeful, determined, cautious, whatever we are. There's a real mix of emotions that we have. And what I want to do today is just give you some models that will help you navigate this unique time that we have to lead through a crisis. And I hope you go away from today feeling that you're not alone. That actually in the emotions that you're feeling and in the struggle and the wrestle of leading in what is the midst of a global crisis, that you'll feel you're not alone, because there are others who share your experiences and your emotions, but also you're not alone, because actually God knows what he's doing and he's working out his plan through each one of us. I'm going to introduce you to a few models today that we've used in our experience in leading through crisis. So my background is I spent 14 years in British Telecom as a senior leader, including a year in the Cabinet Office in the emergency crisis response part of that, and then 14 years leading Samaritan's Purse and their emergency relief work around the world. And a lot of what I draw on here is actually the experience of leading through crisis in places like northern Iraq and Haiti and South Sudan and Mozambique and Nepal and other places where there have been earthquakes or health crises like Ebola, HIV and AIDS, and just apply some of the models that hopefully will help you think through how you can lead well in the midst of a crisis. So on the 12th of April last year, which was about week 3, week 4 of the pandemic, I woke up sensing this all seems very familiar. We were in lockdown, and I was thinking and praying through, how can I help the leaders that I work with, the chief execs of charities and senior church leaders, think about how we're going to respond over this next year or so. People were running around building hospitals in emergency response mode, seeking to save lives, pivoting their services to online, running fast, and just trying to stand back and say, well, what's a model that can help? And this model of response, recovery, reconstruction is one that is used in emergency response right around the world as a model to help people think about how to respond in the midst of earthquakes or health pandemics like Ebola. And lots of people have found it very helpful as they've thought about how to respond to this crisis with COVID-19. So I recorded this video on the 10th of April last year. I'm just resharing it because I recognize I haven't shared my sound. I'd just like you to watch it, recognizing that it was recorded 9 months ago.
As we go into week 4 of lockdown, I just wanted to share a brief insight with you, a model which might be helpful for you as you look to the future of structuring your organization. It's a model that comes from experience of emergency relief and response right around the world. So it's important to think of this phase that we're in as emergency response. And during that phase, what happens is that people are running hard to get basic supplies, basic needs. You really strip back to the lowest level of the Maslow hierarchy, which is how do we get food, how do we get water? How do we ensure that our health survives? How do we look after people so that we can get through this phase? And it's characterized by people running fast and hard and often by burnout, and lasts for weeks to several months. Then after that phase comes the recovery phase, and that phase can last 6 months to 12 months, depends on the nature of the crisis. And really important as we think about coronavirus to think, what are those 6 to 12 months going to look like as we come out of lockdown, as we come out of the emergency response phase? And our experience in disasters and responding to disasters around the world is that those 6 to 12 months are characterized by trauma, by grief, by a tsunami of anxiety and mental health issues, people lacking confidence to get back to normal, feeling that their world has been shaken up and down, and not really knowing what normal is. And so what we're saying to organizations is prepare for that, to churches, prepare for that, get ready for the fact that there's going to be an elongated period where you're going to need people who can come alongside those in your organization and support their well-being, to speaking to their mental health and anxiety. It's going to be a time that's going to be characterized by memorial services, an outpouring of grief, all of the emotions that are pent up right now and maybe engaged in just the adrenaline that's running, because we're trying to respond and pivot right now. All of that will come out, and we need to be ready for that. And then the third phase is one of reconstruction, and we expect that to happen during 2021 and on into 22 and 23. And in that reconstruction phase, we're facing up to the reality of more scarce resources in terms of finances, facing up to the reality of new sets of values, new ways of doing things. We're reimagining what the future will look like. And that reconstruction in this instance is going to be influenced by a number of factors. One is our health will be more important to us. Our relationships and our family will be more important to us. We'll have a greater level of concern for fairness and justice in our society. We'll have a greater level of concern for our key workers, and for how they're looked after and cared for, and a greater appreciation for them. And also trust will be a scarce commodity as we start to rebuild society and rebuild our relationship. So important as we think about that phase, how's your organization going to respond through those different lenses? I hope you have a great week, and I hope that model of response, recovery, and then reconstruction is helpful to you as you think about your strategy as a business and organization going forward.
So that was 9 months ago, and these 3 phases have helped leaders and are helping leaders think about how they respond in different circumstances. So we've been through multiple response phase, haven't we? You could argue that we're in the 3rd response phase now, with multiple recovery periods. And every time we go back into a response phase, it's always about safety and stability, stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. It's all about the present moment. How do we save lives now? It's all about delivery and execution, whether that's vaccine rollout, building Nightingale hospitals, dispatching ambulances on time to get people into ICU and ITU units. So, and that response phase, the key personality types are activists, planners, doers, really, really important. And every time we go into a recovery phase, we start this sense of reflection and learning. We want to be looking backwards, but also looking forwards. And actually that recovery phase is a time when we need our emotions engaged and we need to be people focused, because actually what happens in a response phase is emotions get pushed down. because you're running so fast, working so hard to deliver life-saving services, and because you're focused on the present moment and you're focused on survival, emotions get pushed down, and they only really come up when people are starting to get back to normal and starting to get back into connection with people and enabling a sense of recovery. And then reconstruction phase is characterized by rebuilding and renewing and looking forward and creativity and ideas. And it really suits those who as leaders are values-based and strategic thinkers. Now, when I first shared this 9 months ago, a colleague of mine said, yeah, but that response, recovery, reconstruction, it's in Hosea. It's in Hosea chapter 6. And Alan kind of pointed out that to me. And of course, this is a mirror of what Jesus was going to do in going through his death and resurrection. But also it talks to us about our sense of going through response and recovery and construction. He will bind up our wounds, but after 2 days, he will revive us. And on the third day, he will restore us. And so Hosea speaks deeply into our lived reality right now of binding up wounds in the response phase. But then in the recovery phase, there's a real opportunity to allow space for God to breathe new life into us as we seek to be recovered and to recover from a pandemic and from an emergency and a crisis. Then how are we creating space to allow that breath of life, that breath of God? Because the reality is for many of us as leaders that actually we're type A. We want to rush on to the rebuilding. We want to rush on to the reconstruction. We want to rush on to getting things built anew and back to normal. But actually there's a pattern in what God does, which is actually he causes us to recover from our injuries before we start rebuilding. And he causes us to actually be revived before we are restored, and to breathe new life into us during that time. Now, since I put this slide in as new over the last few months, because actually there's a reality that this is different to something like an earthquake, because actually we've gone through the response and recovery cycle multiple times, and it almost feels like we're stuck in a iterative cycle of response and recovery. And I think what that does is just emphasize that actually we're experiencing more trauma, we're experiencing more grief, we're experiencing more need to run fast and to rescue. And actually every time we come out of that, we need to go through recovery phase. So in the recovery phase, these are some of the characteristics of a recovery phase, which I mentioned in the video. First of all, trauma, anxiety, grief, and mental health issues are to the fore. People find it hard to get back to normal, to straight back to normal. It takes time for that to happen. There's a stat that after the 7/7 bombings in London on the Underground, it took 2.5 years for the traffic level to get back to normal level after those bombings. Such was the reality of people's emotional response. So it's not so much what physically happens to us, but our emotional response and the fear and the anxiety associated with public spaces, and getting back into public spaces took a long, long time. And there's a sense in which we're all adapting to the next normal. I like this more than the new normal. There isn't one fixed new normal. There's just the next normal. So our next normal is church online and in person. Then our next normal is we're back to online again. And then our next normal is maybe we'll be able to run youth groups. And then our next normal. Yeah, and there's this sense as leaders that we're having to lead through these multiple next normals. Yeah, what is the next normal, and how do we adapt to that next normal? And the reality for many people in our congregations is that the financial concerns are beginning to weigh heavily now on many people. The level of redundancy and the level poverty is increasing across society. And what we see is that is normal in a crisis. You can go to Haiti, you can go to Northern Iraq, you can go to South Sudan. After every crisis, there's financial concern. After every crisis, there's concern about injustice and inequalities. And also after every, and I think just as a side on that, I think Black Lives Matter was only the start of what we will see in terms of people's responses to things that are unfair and the rising up against things that are unjust. And there's a deepened sense that actually COVID has hit people in different ways, and that if you're of a different ethnicity and you're a different background and you have higher levels of poverty, then you're much more likely to be more deeply impacted by this crisis. And that's not fair. And there's a sense of us crying out about anger and injustice, and that's quite normal in a crisis, but I see it here being repeated. And also I see heightened levels of value. We question in a crisis, what is really important to us? What do we really value? And I've just listed 5 things here. You could list a number, but our health is more important. We're going to see that coming out of the back end. I would suspect for people who can afford it, they will be paying for higher levels of health insurance. I suspect for people who can afford it, that they will actually be going for greater levels of coverage because of what's happened. Our health will be more important. We'll be more anxious to get fit and to look after our bodies. It will be a key element for us for the next decade, I would suggest. Our primary relationships, those who've cared for us, those who are close to us, our close family, those who've kept in contact with us, a heightened sense of a value around that, the heightened sense of the value of what we can do together. Clap for carers, being together, delivering through food banks, getting food parcels out. What can we do together? A heightened value around slowing down and resting, and a heightened value around innovation and what works in this new environment. And so some of the key recovery questions for leaders are, how well are we looking after people's well-being and mental health? How well are we dealing with the trauma caused by the impact of the pandemic on our people? Now, these are normal questions. These are questions we would have used in Samaritan's Purse to help our teams work through the aftermath of Haiti or the aftermath of the war in Northern Iraq. How can we enable people to regain confidence, again, including in us? What services will be needed in a new environment where there's higher levels of taxation, lower levels of disposable income, and higher levels of unemployment? That's going to be a reality for us for the next 3 to 5 years, at least. An opportunity for this church to serve, but as leaders, how are we responding to that? And how can we help people start to reflect on what has happened and to rethink the future? And on top of that, there are specific demands on us as individuals. So there's everything that's going on in our environment, but actually I coach many leaders of charities, chief execs, senior teams, church leaders. Everyone is saying right now, caring for myself in this prolonged crisis is a massive challenge. It's been going on for so long that actually looking after my own emotional health amongst growing pastoral demands is a massive challenge. And living with an increased sense of uncertainty on an ongoing basis is a specific challenge to me as leaders, as is helping others to live with increased uncertainty as well. And I think we're going to see some other things come to play as we go through coming out of recovery. So I keep saying to people, our hope is not found in the vaccine, our hope is in Jesus Christ. And actually our hope, the danger is that we say our hope is in the vaccine and we want to get back to reconstruction. And actually we now need to allow people to grieve. Jesus said, didn't he, that blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. There is a sense in which as leaders, we need to allow people to mourn. We need to allow people to be comforted. We need to allow people to walk through this time and recognize that people will want to go at different speeds as they come out. The rebuilders, the evangelists, the strategists, the highly resilient will want to go fast. They'll want to know, what are we doing next? How are we rebuilding? How are we reconstructing? Why aren't we going faster? but the processors and the emotionally engaged and the people focus and those who are to whom safety and security is important will say, slow down, slow down. There's been an impact here. We've come close to global mortality. We've come close to death. We've come close to a crisis that we nearly didn't survive through, where our NHS was in peril. Slow down. And people have been impacted in different ways. Some people have been impacted by grief, some impacted as key workers, some impacted by redundancy. People have experienced this crisis in different ways. If you're a home worker or a homeschooler or an entrepreneur, or you're isolated and lonely, you've experienced the pandemic in a different way. And so what we're saying to leaders is make sure you have all of these voices around you speaking into how you rebuild. Be wary of going too fast, but be wary of going too slow. Be wary of meeting the needs of one group of people, but not of the others. We need to have a holistic view of how people have been impacted. Don't be tempted to rush. Take time to be refreshed and revived yourself and with your people as well, and wait in God's presence and find joy in walking through it together. So I think there are 7 key priorities for leaders at this time. I'm using this in all of my work now with senior leaders. So firstly, acknowledging our own fragility and being vulnerable and understanding it's okay not to be okay. It's okay, even as a leader, it's okay not to be okay. And I think, we need to get over our guilt and shame of being in the line of people who need help. Vulnerability is just a long word for saying I need help. I remember a time where I was the last person who would go forward for prayer ministry at my church because I was in leadership. Because I felt shame and guilt over the fact that I needed help. This is a global pandemic. We all need help. None of us have been here before. None of us have walked through this before. None of us have experienced this before. None of us have had to lead churches through this before. If you're still standing and you're here 9 months in, you're doing really well. Really, really well. Give yourself a pat on the back. It's okay not to be okay. Secondly, we need to push into our own support networks like we never have before. Just saying, I need help. Will you walk this with me? I get thoughts that are difficult. I'm finding it hard to hold it all together. Being determined and persevering all the time is really difficult. How can you help me? Thirdly, we need to continue to examine rhythms of life and push into those that keep you positive and bring life. The reality is that the rhythms that work for you in response won't work for you in recovery. The rhythms that work for you in recovery won't necessarily work for you in reconstruction. And so there's a constancy of needing to reevaluate how are our rhythms working for us, and are they building life and positivity? Are we getting enough rest? In Samaritan's Purse, if someone served in a response phase, they had four days on and 3 days off. In recovery phase, it was 4 days off every fortnight. And then in reconstruction, we were back to working 5 days a week. But the recognition that actually the emotional demands and the physical demands and the spiritual demands on all of us are huge right now. And so what rhythms are positive for you and bring life? Leaning into the sacrament of the present moment. There's a phrase, I can't remember where it comes from, but Baroness Cox is the person I heard it from, who used to say, all we have is the present moment. The reality that we're used to building barns, aren't we? We're used to planning 3 to 5 years and building barns. And yet there is a sense in this moment where God wants to meet us in our present reality, in the present moment, and say, my grace is sufficient for you today. My grace is sufficient for you in this hour. My grace is sufficient for you in this moment, the sacrament of the present moment. I think we need to push into a new emotional language, and we're going to cover that in the second half of this session, as well as learning tools in the midst of uncertainty, which we'll also go into, and keeping focus on purpose and vision. That's going to be the part, the next half an hour. Open up for discussion. What have been your experiences of how you and your team have navigated through uncertainty? What have you been putting in place to increase your own support network? How have you been helping yourself and others to push into a new emotional language? Anyone want to have a go at thinking about those questions, or making a comment on those questions, or asking a question on what we've been through so far? And then I want to dig into uncertainty, emotional language, and then purpose and vision. So, anyone burning to ask a question or to give a reflection on those questions that I asked? David.
Second time I've heard you speak on this, and the first time was really helpful in the summer with the Baptist Union webinar that you did. Really helpful to navigate the last 6 months with the leadership team. I just wonder, a lot of the examples that this is based upon in your experience have an end date to them. Earthquakes happen, and there's an end date. A flood happens, a hurricane happens, there's an end date. It strikes me as we move forwards actually into the next year, there is no clear end date to COVID. The vaccine might be helpful in reducing hospital admissions and therefore allowing some normality to return, but the reality is COVID is now going to be part of the illnesses that human beings experience actually going forward into the future. That's something we know from past pandemics like the Spanish flu. So how's that kind of continuing threat, does that have any impact upon this model you're presenting of this response, recovery, reconstruction?
I think my main experience of that would be Ebola in Liberia and West Africa. And there we saw prolonged periods of trauma and anxiety. And so I would say it just prolongs the sense of finding a new emotional language and helping people cope with that new emotional language, and makes it slower to get back to any real sense of reconstruction. And I would also say that the idea of next normal rather than new normal is a really helpful one for leadership teams to think about, because actually you are going to go through this continuous change and continuous uncertainty. And so some of the tools that I look at in the second half about dealing with uncertainty and dealing with an emotional language become more part of our norm rather than just a fixed time length that we go through. And maybe God is trying to teach us something in that, actually, and we'll touch that on a little bit. That's a really good question, David. I've adjusted my model to put that response recovery loops in as to make that clearer as a result. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lisa. Nice to see you, Lisa.
Nice to see you, Simon. Just a reflection, really. So we've got quite a broad staff team and then leadership team as well. And I would say that the way we cope was, and my colleague's here so he can disagree with me, is that we kind of made a smaller team, that some of us stepped up and we kind of had to make decisions rapidly and deal with things rapidly, and connection was more challenging, of course, so it's easier to 4 people on a Zoom than 8 people. And just one of the kind of observations now is that we did that, I think, pretty effectively and well, but in the midst of that we probably hurt some people, but there's probably a bit of emotional fallout, and things that you would have discussed carefully and worked to slowly didn't happen, and so it worked, but now we've got to deal with what has happened as a result of the immediate response.
And particularly in environments where you're used to a very collaborative working style, the switch to command and control is really hard on people. And interestingly, in my experience in emergency, we had emergency response and then development teams. And the development teams were always collaborative, and the emergency response were always command and control, a massive clash of culture between them. I think, yeah, I think it is just a question of saying to, well, just a question. It's a question of saying to people, look, that was for a time, and actually every emergency response, if it's going to move quickly, that's what happened. Look at Gold Command, look at emergency response around the world. You have to have that command and control, but actually to name what you want your model to be going forward. So we want to be much more collaborative going forward, and we don't want to use that style unless we get into an emergency again, in which we might need to. But that's not our default style. That's not where we want to go.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That's helpful.
Thank you.
Notes, that'll be good.
Ruth, I'll just take one more question, then I'll move on to the rest of the content. So Ruth?
Yeah, just a question. Looking at the various sort of things to do with response and recovery, we seem to have been in response the whole 9 months. The safety and security. Yeah. At what point, is there a point when you know you're in recovery? Do you wait until the danger's gone away? I'm not. Is it for a leader to move people on to recovery, or do you just carry on responding until they're ready?
So I think there are flexible edges to those phases, because people move at different speeds. So there are certainly people who are going through recovery during the summer last year. Okay, there were definitely people who were starting to express their emotions and their hurt of what they've been through, and those emotions were coming out because of closer physical contact. But for other people, they won't have experienced that during the summer, and they would have felt like they're in an emergency response. All I would say is the longer that goes on, so the longer that emotions are pressed down, then the more you need to prepare for that time when people are going to need to process. Yeah, so actually training people in grief and anxiety responses and trauma responses becomes more and more important for you as a church. Okay, brilliant questions. Let's go through the next bit of content, and I'll try and leave some questions, some time for questions at the end as well. So. Looking at some of the priorities in more detail. So pushing into a new emotional language, handling uncertainty, and keeping focused on purpose and vision. So let's talk about a new emotional language. So the reality is that we need to give people an opportunity to lament. The reality is, you know, in America, 250,000 deaths, in the UK, 80,000 deaths. We've had an encounter with our mortality. Matthew Paris wrote a great piece in the Times on Saturday, I don't know if you saw it, which talked about the stranger sitting on the end of our bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, and the reality that not a single one of us hasn't thought about what would happen if COVID came to our family and to us, and the level of anxiety that has grown, and the uncertainty that's grown. There are also a lot of people with disappointment that plans didn't work out, their weddings didn't go ahead, they weren't able to have a funeral with all the people they expected to be there. Huge disappointment. Now, the wonderful thing is that we have scriptures which are full of language which help us to help people in the midst of this mourning and grief. And I think that actually the church needs to regain its sense of entering into grief with people, and enter into anxiety and uncertainty and disappointment with people, because the Psalms are full of it. You know, I cry out to God, yes, I shout, oh that God would listen to me. When I was in deep trouble, I searched for the Lord. All night long I prayed with hands lifted to heaven, but my soul was not comforted. Psalm 77. And yet, verse 11, but then I recall all you have done, Lord. I remember your wonderful deeds of long ago. There's incredible language. You know, if you want to know how to get a new emotional language, incredible language there that can help people deal with their emotions and go through this sense of grief. And so what we're saying to leaders is train people in empathy and dealing with trauma, grief, anxiety, and lament. Come alongside people who are processing, create opportunities for that to happen. We're doing that on Zoom right now. We're running a Kintsugi Hope Wellbeing group in our church, have 20 people on it talking vulnerably about how they have dealt with the grief and how are they dealing with anxiety. There is no doubt that what is hidden will emerge. And in terms of responding to our communities, how are we going to help? There's not going to be enough counsellors to go around to help people who need to process what they've been through. Where's the church in this moment? So pushing into a new emotional language. And some of us as leaders need to find that emotional language for ourselves as well to be able to express that. Then secondly, dealing with ongoing uncertainty. So part of the discomfort we're feeling is the dispelling of the myth that we were ever in control. Yeah, we thought we knew what we were doing. Okay, in 3 years we will do this, in 2 years we will do that. Here's my strategic plan, then we'll do this, and then we'll do that. We'll go to build these barns, and we'll go to this city, and we'll go to that city. So how do we deal with ongoing uncertainty? Even before this crisis, people in business were talking about VUCA environments. Volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environments. They were saying that actually the nature of doing business in our society is volatile. The environment changes quickly. It's uncertain. It's complex. There are so many interdependencies, and it feels unfamiliar. It feels like you've just landed on the moon, and everything in your kit bag that used to work doesn't work anymore. It's a VUCA environment. Or it can feel like you're stuck in a maze and you don't know the way out as a leader as well. It really can. And actually, the research we did into millennials actually revealed to us that the younger generations are much better at dealing with uncertainty than we are. I am as a baby boomer. So basically, I was brought up to solve problems, to find my way out of the maze. That's what leaders do. Give me a problem, I'll find a way out of the maze. Okay. Actually, what this is teaching us with the uncertainty is how do we live well in the maze? How do we live with uncertainty in the maze when we can't see the way out? There's a technical term for that, and that's living with polarities or leading through polarities, and learning to lead through polarities rather than solving problems. So I'll explain what a polarity is quite quickly. So an example of a polarity is breathing. If I breathe in and I don't breathe out, I die. If I breathe out and I don't breathe in, I die. It's a polarity. I have to inhale and exhale. I have to breathe in and breathe out. I have to get my oxygen and clean out my carbon dioxide. It's a polarity. Our world is full of polarities. In this crisis, we've seen these polarities. Health and the economy. How do we balance health and the economy? How do we balance challenge and safety? How do we hold that in tension? How do we balance progress and well-being? How do we balance online and offline? How do we balance being forward focused and yet backward looking and reflective? How do we balance planning and experimentation? How do we balance this desire that actually we want to do online church brilliantly and with excellence, and yet we want amazing grace towards everybody who's involved because we know that we're living through a really difficult time? How do we hold those things in tension? And so one of the things as leaders that we need to learn to do is actually to manage polarities, to actually learn the way of saying there are good things from looking after our health, but there are also good things of looking after our economy. There are good things out of meeting in person, but there are good things out of meeting online as well. There are good things about making progress and getting into recovery, but there's good things about looking after our well-being. But there are also downsides of both of those things as well. And this tool, when your team is, if you're constantly asking yourself, is this a polarity, a tension that I'm dealing with that I have to hold, or is it a problem I need to solve? And for far too many times, we solve tensions and we manage problems rather than solving problems and managing tensions. There are some tensions that we just need to learn how to manage. So a question for you to reflect on: where you see tensions, polarities that you need to hold in this current crisis? What are those tensions and those polarities that you just need to learn to hold rather than striving to fix it? You just need to hold it in tension with your team as well. And then finally, and I'll just take a few minutes on this, in the increased level of uncertainty, it's easy to think that you can't plan or you can't move forward. If I can use Liberia as an example again, and Ebola as an example, when we deployed a team to respond to Ebola, we didn't know what they were going to face. When we first sent them into Liberia, we didn't know they would end up building a hospital. We didn't know that one of them would catch Ebola and have to be flown out of Liberia. We didn't know what they would face on the ground. We didn't know that mobs would attack their compound. We didn't know that. But we were very clear on the purpose and vision that that team had, okay? And one of the ways as leaders of managing through uncertainty is to double down on the clarity that you have of purpose and vision so that you can release your teams to actually navigate anything that's thrown at them. So our tendency in an emergency is to draw all the decision-making back to us and to draw it back to an individual, and therefore we get exhausted and we get decision fatigue, rather than doubling down and saying, you know what, I can't write a plan for next year, but I can be really clear about what our purpose and vision is. I can be really clear about what our guiding principles are. I can set the riverbanks in which we're going to operate. And then within that, well, who knows whether we'll be online or offline? Who knows whether youth group will be able to open again? Who knows what we'll be doing about that church building project that we were planning about? But we're clear. This is what we're about. We're about disciples making disciples, or we're about releasing everybody into to ministry, or we're about creating missional communities, or we're about releasing resources into our community to meet well-being needs. But this is our purpose and vision, and this is the clarity that we have. And so this idea of riverbanks, of boundaries, boundary purpose and vision can really help your teams to think, you know what, I can flex in the way that I do it, but actually it's still within this purpose and vision. And a lot of organizations that I find are floundering right now are floundering because that purpose and vision isn't clear, and therefore they're exhausted all the time on decision making because they're not doing it within a set of riverbanks. And some of the things you can also build up around the riverbanks are ethos and values and behaviors, your operating principles, your missiology, your way you do mission, the way you do discipleship. You can build that out. But the key thing I want to leave with you really is be clear about your purpose and vision within that riverbanks. And you can lead people into the future with a hope and a vision and a sense of purpose, which is growing, which adapts to the circumstances, which leads through the uncertainty, and leads people into the future which God has prepared for them and prepared for you. And as the vaccine comes online, as we do get more freedoms, the churches that have clarity about purpose and vision are going to find it so much easier to come out of recovery and into reconstruction. But the pace of that will be vitally important as we walk with people who are walking at very different speeds during that. I'm going to finish then, and hopefully we'll get 10 minutes for questions and discussion. So Daryl, you've raised your hand, so feel free to go.
Yeah, in our church, we have a variety of opinion, even amongst the leadership, from COVID deniers to, you know, mad headless chickens, and it's been, I've been trying to focus, and I like you talk about polarities, that just try and bear with it. This is all peripheral stuff to our faith. You know, we united in Christ, but it has been difficult just to, you know, everyone has a tendency to want to demonize an alternative view. How do you sort of push through that?
Has anyone got any good ideas on that? Anyone else facing similar problems to that? Or do people generally find that actually their leaderships are very clear about what they're facing in terms of COVID?
I mean, to this point, well, on Sunday we had a live stream service and an in-person service, because it was trying to say, well, you know, there may be room for both. I wasn't personally, one, but
and so I think what I've been saying about holding things in tension is really important for you. Yeah, that actually taking your leadership team through the process of saying, well, what's really good about online? Well, it helps people who are isolated to connect. It helps people who are vulnerable to connect. It might help us reach other people who normally wouldn't come into a church building. Yeah. What's not so good about online? Well, it doesn't create the sense of community. It doesn't create the sense of belonging that we want to see. And just listing, I'm not saying those are right, by the way, I'm just saying listing them out, as what's positive and what's negative, and saying, actually, you know, we're not presenting an alternative reality here. We're just coping with a severe set of circumstances in which we're trying to manage this. And there are different people for whom different things will work. And we need to hold that intention rather than flipping from one side to the other. Now, what you can do with a polarity map like that is come back to it in 6 months' time and say, okay, things have changed now. There aren't as many people who are isolated and who wouldn't come into a church building. Yeah, but actually we might still want to run an online service because we're reaching a different group of people. So we might want to do that, but we might want to do it for a different reason, you know, and just to wrestle with that. Hope that's helpful, Daryl.
Thank you.
Paul Farrow.
Daryl, just on that point you picked up there, within our church since July, when they first let us back in the buildings, we've run a mixed interactive service. So we actually have both Zoom and physical presence in the room. We put on our big projector the same screen you're seeing in front of yourself now on your computer screen. We put it up there so that people can see the people who are zooming in from home. And we put a camera in the church so they can see the people who are in the church as well as the speaker. And we've got it geared into our PA so that the people in their homes can join in the prayer time, share whenever they want. And so we've completely integrated those services. And that actually, as Simon said, that will be our model going forward. We will not just end Zoom as we first thought we might do after the lockdown. We said, no, we'll keep it and we'll retain it. And that will be our model going forward. Right. Full interactive church with two home and church locations.
I think one of the wonderful things about this crisis is just the amount of innovation that's happened. You know, most churches saw more change in 7 days between the 23rd and the 30th of March than they've seen in 7 years prior to that. And actually the innovation that's come about, from drive-in services to drive-in carol services to carol on your doorstep to, you know, is just incredible. And it's just releasing creativity in people to say, actually, we're up against a set of circumstances here that we don't know how to respond to. And someone comes up with a brilliant idea and in they go, and that's great. So brilliant.
And there's a knock-up, sorry, I finished.
Yeah, so I'm going to take a...
We've had, because we had people who were shut-ins in our church, and they, for the first time in years, have participated in all the services, and some of them we've just given them iPads.
Yeah, so opportunities to reach new audiences. Phil Burns. Phil, can I come to you?
Thanks, Simon. I absolutely agree with the whole innovation, which has been brilliant. But certainly for me, there was a slight overwhelmingness to lots of innovations. Is that there was a huge bombardment of, you could be doing this, you could be doing that, and people who putting really good ideas online, and you were almost playing catch up, and you became very aware that there was a lot of it was like comparisonitis on hyperdrive. Everyone was comparing everything else, and that created a bit of pressure. One thing that I think Lisa and I would agree on is that we just kind of said, this is what we're offering, this is what we can do, trying to replicate.
And that's about purpose and vision, again, isn't it? It's about having those riverbanks and saying, this is what we're about, this is what is uniquely us, this is who we are, and how we do it might change, but actually it gives you a framework. And I think in uncertainty, we tend to throw all the boundaries away and say anything is possible. Well, no, anything isn't possible. Yeah, we are going to stick to our purpose and vision, and we're going to be clear about that, and we're going to double down on articulating it, actually. Yeah, and where part of that purpose and vision can't be fulfilled because of the circumstances, we name it. So in our church, we've said, we're about creating missional communities. Well, some of that mission can't happen right now in the way that it happened, but it's what we're about. We're not going to go back to where we were. It's still what we're about, and being really clear. And so I would encourage you, just double down on that purpose and vision, create that clarity in those riverbanks, and within that, make the choices that are right for you. But also, there's a real wisdom in this moment of saying, good enough is enough. Yeah, we're in a global pandemic, folks. Good enough is enough. You don't have to run an online service that's like who's got 15 staff, and if you've got 2 staff, you won't be true to your community anyway. If you
That's
do.
true. We had one person who commented saying that when it was too slick, it wasn't us, and we heard that, and actually that was quite liberating. I
really like that. And we got 3 minutes, so I'm going to try and take 2 more questions. So Fiona.
Hi. I'm from Renew Wellbeing, the charity, and I would say a lot of what we've been doing, just to encourage everybody through the pandemic and the lockdown, there's been an explosion of people wanting to have Renew Wellbeing spaces, and I see that as part of the recovery phase. We're getting people, in the past people would have wanted to come to do activities and hobbies, and what we found was people were coming and they just wanted to talk because they'd been isolated and they just wanted to see other people. Going to you, I'm really interested in your model that you've explained to us about the recovery. No. Yeah. Response, recovery, reconstruction.
Yeah.
Similar to Ruth's question, obviously there will be people that will take a lot longer over their recovery.
Yeah.
Or to go through the recovery phase. Is it a bad thing to get on with reconstruction while people are still recovering, or do you think that's something that can work side by side?
I think they have to work side by side. Yeah.
Because you could end up being stuck, couldn't you?
My fear is the nature of leaders is that we are self-starter, builders, entrepreneur, go-getters. We want to make the world different, and we're going for it at the fastest speed that we possibly can. Gross stereotype, okay? But there are a lot of people like that. My fear is that actually, the reality of digging down into people's emotional well-being, gets ignored or doesn't get given the space that it needs. And we want to, there's something that drives our sense of achievement, that drives us to want to rebuild, and the comparisonitis that Phil Burns talked about, there's something that drives us to that. And I'm just saying, if ever there was a time where you need to slow down and dig into the support that you're going to give to people's emotional well-being, it's now and during that recovery phase. And you guys at Renew Wellbeing do a great job, by the way. So
well, I was just going to show you Ruth's new book's out, Slow Down, Show Up and Pray. So yes,
brilliant.
A lot of what you're saying is resonating with our vision.
Thank you for listening. I hope that's been helpful to you. A recording of this will be up on the website together with the slides. So hopefully that will give you some good resources as you go.